The old farmhouse stood alone on the barren Wisconsin land, wrapped in a silence too thick to be normal. It was the kind of place that made your stomach turn just looking at it. A place where time had stopped, where something evil had sunk its roots deep into the soil. Mary Larson had grown up hearing the whispers about Ed Gein, the odd man who lived on the outskirts of town. People in Plainfield mostly ignored him. He was just weird old Eddie, the quiet handyman who never quite fit in. But nobody thought twice about him. Not until the horror of what he had done came crawling out of that decayed farmhouse, gripping the town in a terror that never truly left. The vanishing. It was a bitter November evening in 1957 when Mary's mother, Bernice Worden, vanished. She ran the local hardware store and everyone knew her. That morning, a customer saw Ed Gein in the shop asking about antifreeze. But by noon, the store was empty. The cash register was missing. And on the floor, right by the counter, was a smear of blood. Sheriff Art Schley led the search, and every clue pointed to one place: the Gein farm. Nobody wanted to go. Even in a town as small as Plainfield, Ed's house had a reputation. It had been lifeless since his mother, Augusta, died. The windows were boarded up. The fields around it were dead. A foul smell, thick and rotten, drifted from the place even in the coldest months. But the sheriff didn't have a choice. He took his men and drove toward the farm, headlights cutting through the misty evening air. When they arrived, everything was still, too still. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. And that's when the nightmare began. The house of horror. The stench hit them first. It wasn't just rot. It was decay, death, and something far worse. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing walls cluttered with junk, newspapers stacked to the ceiling, and filth covering every inch of space. But that wasn't what made them gag. It was the skin. Human skin. A lampshade stretched and stitched together from faces. A belt crafted from human nipples. A chair seat, leather, but not from any animal. Skulls lined the shelves like trophies. Fingers, lips, and ears were stuffed into jars. A box of noses sat by the stove. And then they found her. Bernice Worden was hanging upside down from a wooden beam, her body split open like a deer after a hunt. She had been gutted, decapitated, and strung up like meat. Some of the officers stumbled outside, vomiting. Sheriff Schley just stood there, frozen, unable to process the sheer inhumanity of what he was seeing. But the worst part? This wasn't a one-time thing. The skin collector Ed Gein had been digging up graves for years. They found 10 skulls in his bedroom. Some had been turned into bowls. Others had candle wax dripping down their hollowed-out eye sockets. He had been removing the skin from dead women and sewing them together into a grotesque woman's suit. When they dragged Ed in for questioning, his confession was eerily calm. "I wanted to be her," he admitted, his blank eyes staring ahead. "I wanted to be my mother." Augusta Gein had ruled his life with an iron fist. She was fanatically religious, teaching him that women, except for her, were evil, disgusting, and corrupt. When she died, something inside Ed snapped. That's when the grave robbing started. That's when the skinning began. He wasn't just killing, he was trying to bring her back. The end of the horror. Ed Gein was declared insane and sent to a mental institution for the rest of his life. He died in 1984, but his story never did. Even now, his crimes haunt the world. His twisted obsession inspired Psycho's Norman Bates, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface, and the Silence of the Lambs Buffalo Bill. His house of horrors may have been burned to the ground, but the terror he created never truly disappeared. Because the real horror? Ed Gein wasn't a monster from a movie. He was real. And the things he did, they weren't fiction. They were worse. The monster in apartment 213. The apartment smelled. It was a thick, rancid stench, something between rotting meat and chemicals. The kind of smell that clung to your skin, got into your throat, and stayed there. People in the Oxford apartments on 25th Street had complained about it for months. They had knocked on apartment 213, told the man inside, Jeffrey Dahmer, to clean up whatever was causing the god-awful stink. He always had an excuse. "My freezer broke," he'd say, or "I had some bad meat go rotten." But inside that apartment, behind a locked door, was a horror so sickening, so inhuman, that even the most hardened police officers would never forget what they found. The last survivor. Tracy Edwards ran. He didn't care that he was half naked, that his wrists were still raw from the handcuffs, or that his chest burned from pure terror. All he knew was that he had to get away from that place, from the thing inside that apartment, before he ended up like the others. His feet pounded against the pavement as he tore down the street, his breath coming in gasps. People stared, but he didn't stop until he saw the flashing red and blue lights. Police. "Help me!" he yelled, his voice breaking. "He tried to kill me." Two officers turned to him, eyes narrowing at the sight of the frantic man. His wrists were still shackled, his face pale with shock and something worse. Absolute horror. And then he said the name. Jeffrey Dahmer. Inside the house of death, the officers knocked on apartment 213, expecting to find some drunk, drugged-out creep. But when the door opened, there stood Jeffrey Dahmer, shirtless, calm, too calm. They told him they were checking out a complaint. That's when Dahmer, in an almost bored tone, simply said, "The key to the cuffs is in my bedroom." The officers stepped inside. The smell hit them first. It was thick, wet, rotting, like something died and had been left to fester. Their stomachs churned as they moved deeper inside. But it was when they reached the dresser that everything changed. One officer opened a drawer, and then he saw them. Polaroids, not just of dead bodies, of mutilated bodies. Some with their heads severed, some with their flesh peeled away, some posed in ways that made their humanity vanish altogether. One officer gagged. The other whispered, "These are real." Then his eyes drifted toward the fridge and the freezer. Nobody wanted to open it, but they had to. The officer grabbed the handle and pulled. Inside was a severed human head, eyes wide open, mouth frozen in silent agony. The flesh was preserved, cold, as if it had been waiting. In the freezer they found more, a collection, hands, skulls, a human heart, pieces of flesh carefully wrapped in plastic, labeled like leftovers. The officers couldn't breathe. And in that moment, Jeffrey Dahmer, the quiet man who had always seemed harmless, normal, even polite, tried to run. They tackled him to the floor, but he didn't fight much. He just sighed, almost like he was relieved. The horrors he confessed to what came next was worse. Over days of interrogation, Dahmer talked, and what he revealed made even the most hardened detectives sick. He had killed 17 men, lured them into his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or photo shoots. Then he drugged them, strangled them, and dismembered them. But that wasn't the worst part. He kept them. He boiled flesh off bones to keep the skeletons. He ate parts of his victims. He tried to make them zombies, injecting acid into their brains while they were still alive. And the Polaroids? They were his trophies, each one a moment frozen in horror, a reminder of what he had done. The truth that shook the world. The world would never forget Jeffrey Dahmer. When news broke, people vomited just reading about it. Families of the victims sat in court, listening to the unspeakable things he had done to their sons, brothers, friends. One father, shaking with rage, stood up in court and screamed, "I'll kill you, you son of a bitch!" But Dahmer, he just sat there, blank, empty, as if none of it had ever mattered. In 1994, a fellow inmate took justice into his own hands and beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar in prison. But even now, the horror of apartment 213 remains. The fact that a monster like Jeffrey Dahmer walked among people, smiling, laughing, living, while keeping his victims in his fridge, it proves one thing. Sometimes the real horror isn't the thing hiding under your bed, it's the thing living right next door.